So typically people start a video like this by saying, I'd like to apologize in advance to all the Valencians I'm about to offend. But I'm not gonna do that. For one thing, apologies are for cowards. I'm not scared of you people. For another thing, Spaniards aren't sensitive little babies. They don't wet their pants the minute does something slightly different. They're not Italians. But besides that, I truly don't think there's any real reason to object to making paella in the oven on a sheet pan versus the traditional method in the traditional cooking vessel. I think if you really listen to what I'm about to say, you'll realize that we share a common goal. In the age of the attention economy, the optics of what you're cooking online trump nearly everything else, often at the expense of the final product. I think a home cook following a recipe online on how to make paella in a paella with all the dogmatic Valencian components, rabbit, broad beans, snails, whatever, can still wind up with an inferior end result to what I'm going to show you today. That said, I understand your skepticism. I am not the first person to try making paella in the oven with a sheet pan, but I think there's a decent chance I'm the first person to do it well. When I first had the idea, I did what I usually do when I think of something that would make a good video, which is look it up online, assuming I would immediately be confronted with 1,000 results from other food content creators who've been doing this for years, finding Grub Street, Eater, New York Times cooking section articles headlined, "The Viral Sheet Pan Paella. Everyone is making sheet pan paella. How sheet pan paella is holding space for bisexuals. And finally, we need to talk about the problematic roots of sheet pan paella." Fortunately, that isn't what happened. There are a ton of recipes for sheet pan paella, but they all suck. They fundamentally misunderstand the whole thing, ignoring all the traditional cooking techniques that make it what it is in favor of creating something that, superficially at least, looks like paella. Baked yellow rice with paprika, in which chorizo and mussels sordidly collude over a bed of jasmine rice, frozen peas, and whatever the hell else felt passably Spanish that day. Now, I am not one to get hung up on these self-imposed rules many attempt to enforce regarding a certain dish's authenticity. This is a video for a sheet pan shortcut recipe after all. But there's a difference between pedantically splitting hairs over ingredients just for the hell of it and holding on to the things that make paella what it is instead of some one-pan weeknight ship of Theseus. In my last video, I outlined what I call the 3 essential S's to making paella. They are, in order of appearance, the sofrito, the stock, and the socarrat, and are essential because they're responsible for the final taste of the rice, which ultimately makes paella what it is, rather than the meats, seafoods, vegetables, or anything else that goes on top of it to hog the spotlight. You can't neglect any of the big 3 if you want a paella worth its salt, or saffron, I guess. And fortunately for you, all 3 can be taken care of handily in a sheet pan. Now, before we dispense with it entirely, a note on the paella itself. A beautiful piece of kitchenware, a round stainless steel pan that's more versatile than people are often willing to credit it. This one in particular I've had since my early 20s and has probably made about as many frozen pizzas as paellas. But it's big, it's unwieldy, it doesn't fit well in any of your cabinets, and the good ones are pretty expensive. I would encourage you to track one down if so inclined. But let's compare it to your everyday sheet pan. They're similarly thin, flat, and shallow. The sheet pan is decidedly more shallow, but if you watched my last video, you'll know that doesn't make much of a difference as we're aiming for a pretty thin layer of rice here. That's helpful because less rice means less stock, which means less hot liquid sloshing around while you're trying to maneuver it into your oven. I'm getting ahead of myself here. Hopefully, if you're still watching by this point, you're convinced this whole sheet pan thing isn't as sacrilegious as you initially thought, and you don't just have this video playing in the background while you attempt to look up my address. So let's dive in. Heat your oven to 400 degrees. Set your sheet pan on the stovetop over medium-low heat and pour some oil in the center. I'm using extra virgin olive oil here for the taste, but if it's your first time, I'd recommend something with a higher smoke point like avocado. The sheet pan may be thinner than a lot of skillets you're used to, so take care that nothing burns. The thin pan is useful because it doesn't retain heat as well as, say, cast iron, which will be ideal later on when we're working on the socarrat. But for now, be conservative with your heat. Once the oil is hot, lay down your protein. I'm using boneless skin-on chicken thighs because that's what they had at the store, but bone-in thighs are probably more forgiving, so I'd recommend that for first-timers. These have been seasoned with salt and their skins dried of moisture with a paper towel for better browning. For typical supermarket chicken thighs, cook for around 5 minutes, then flip. These are smaller. I think the smaller the better here, mostly for the end distribution, but any size really works. When they're all in the pan, feel free to increase the heat a little bit up to medium. Once you're happy with the color of the skin and the thighs are at least partially cooked through, remove and set aside. Now we're left with a beautiful pool of chicken fat in which to cook our vegetables. I've got some shiitake mushrooms here left over in my fridge from another meal and a big pinch of salt. Use whatever you want, we're well past the point of orthodoxy here, but if you want something that at least visually approximates the look of Paella Valenciana, also known as the only paella that has a protected designation of origin, throw in something green too. In Valencia, your choice of produce is often influenced by seasonality, so have fun with it. I've done broccolini, but I've also done delicata squash. It really doesn't matter. After the mushrooms have sweat out their moisture a little bit, I'm adding my green veggie in, which today is snap peas. These only need a couple minutes to cook, after which I'll remove and set aside. Now it's time to talk sofrito, the first in our aforementioned 3 essential S's. A lot of people online seem to equate the Spanish sofrito with something akin to the French mirepoix or Louisiana Trinity, but the sofrito doesn't refer to any particular set of ingredients, but rather the process itself of sautéing aromatics in fat in order to accumulate flavors that will impart themselves in the final product. So technically speaking, searing your shrimp or chicken or whatever in the pan is part of the sofrito. Toasting your paprika and blooming your saffron will eventually be a part of the sofrito. This is a concept that's more apparent in Spanish, as the verb sofritir literally means to fry, which kind of tells you all you need to know. I've got about a 1/4 cup of onions and a similar amount of roasted red peppers, all thinly diced, along with a couple cloves of minced garlic. Anything you use to flavor the paella during this stage is, by definition, sofrito, so use your imagination. I've thrown an anchovy in here. When making paella de mariscos, I've used chopped up squid. We're keeping it simple today for the demonstration, but, go nuts. Now, while we're on the subject, I want to touch on the meat and seafood thing. One of the many supposed sins committed by people whose sheet pan paella recipes I encountered while formulating this video was the decision to mix meat and seafood. I think this is a good opportunity to talk about one of the rules you hear about, explain where it comes from, and then handily dispense with it. The reason you're not supposed to mix meat and seafood does not come from some ancient Valencian wisdom inscribed on a tablet handed down in the shape of a farton. It's because historically, the style of paella your family or your village or whatever made had to do with its geographic location. If you lived near the ocean, you used seafood because that's what you had around. If you lived inland, you used meat because that's what you had around. So over time, those ingredient decisions calcify and become habits that are hard to break. Practically speaking, however, cooking a paella that has both meat and seafood can be a little tricky. The seafood paellas in Valencia are often the thinnest ones you can find. After all, fish, squid, and shrimp cook much faster than rabbit, partridge, or chicken, which you often see immersed in a greater quantity of broth, or caldo, so they can braise while the correspondingly increased quantity of rice cooks. Fusing those 2 methods can be pretty unwieldy, as you might end up with overcooked seafood or undercooked meat. That's the only reason people often don't do it. There's no law saying you can't. Obviously, you can fix the problem by cooking everything separately and arranging later on, but part of paella's appeal is it's a one-pan thing at the end of the day. Anyway, moving on. With your heat turned down to low, it's time to add your paprika and incorporate it into the sofrito. Most often you'll see sweet, but I've got this spicy pimenton I brought back from Spain that I like. Don't overdo it here, add too much and it'll elbow out the saffron you spent so much money on. I'd say 2 teaspoons is fine. Crush the saffron threads up a little into tinier pieces so they'll distribute better, and add those in as well. You'll often see people toast the saffron threads in a little packet of aluminum foil first, but I find that most saffron sold in the US comes pre-toasted, so I skip it. Next, add a little bit of crushed tomato or tomato puree, a few tablespoons at most just for body. Traditionally, this is fresh tomato that you grate into the mixture, but out of season, something canned is preferable. Stir that around until it's fried a little bit to get rid of its raw taste. The second essential S is the stock, or broth. Probably broth, I guess, since that's what caldo translates to, but that doesn't start with an S, so that's not what I'd say. The difference in this case is negligible, as we're not really after something gelatinous and chock full of collagen. That sort of thing is great in slow-simmered stews and braises, but in a shallow pan with a bottom layer we intend on eventually crisping up into the socarrat, the added proteins from the collagen only serve to increase the risk of burning down the road, so if you ask me, store-bought is probably your best bet. That said, I find it's best to spike the store-bought broth with a little better than bouillon, because I read on a label once that stock or broth with a 1/3 ratio of chicken or seafood or whatever is ideal, and the brand of stock I use is only around 22%. I add a touch of salt here too to season the rice, but consider adjusting your strategy if your stock or broth is well salted already. This is your last chance to influence the final seasoning of your rice, keep in mind, although it's better to undersalt and just sprinkle a little bit on top of your final plate if needed rather than risk overdoing it. Either way, heat your stock up in a pot so that it's nearly at a simmer by the time you're ready to dump it in. Time to talk rice. This is another component where self-imposed rules often get in the way of the big picture. I can't claim to know on a scientific level what makes certain rice varietals more conducive to paella than others. I watched that one episode of Good Eats and it all went over my head. But one thing you hear often as non-negotiable is that you must use either bomba or calaspara rice for paella. Now, if you can believe it, I think this is negotiable. Time after time, the kind of rice I encountered more than any other when I was actually in Valencia was albufera rice, named for the swampy farmland it hails from just south of the city of Valencia. It's a hybrid of bomba rice and another type called senia, and I elect to use it here mostly because I want to get as close as possible to the stuff I ate when I was there. Now that said, I want to point out that when I was doing my initial round of testing for this video, I didn't want to use up all the good stuff I brought home in my suitcase, choosing instead to use this cheaper rice, or fancy pearl rice I found at my grocery store. And I gotta tell you, it works pretty well. If you have a Mexican grocery store near you, or any grocery store with a well-stocked Mexican section in their international foods aisle, there's decent odds they sell arroz valenciano like this. That's my budget recommendation. I can't really vouch for any other types and tend not to love the results you get with arborio or sushi rice, but use whatever you can get your hands on. Conventional wisdom when it comes to portion sizes is 100 grams of rice per person, along with an extra little pinch por los pollos, which is fun. I'm after a pretty thin layer here, so I only intend on making enough for 2, maybe 3 people. That means 250 grams of rice and eventually 3 times that in stock, which doesn't sound like a lot and frankly isn't. If you're having people over for dinner, be prepared to double all this and use 2 sheet pans. Dump the rice in and mix it together with the sofrito. Once it's covered in the flavorful fatty mixture and has lightly toasted for around a minute, add in your hot broth and stir. I'm somewhat agnostic on the effect that toasting your rice prior to adding the broth has on the whole thing, but they do it in Valencia and I like the way it looks, so I follow suit. Cut the heat and try as best as you can to even the rice out into one single layer. Don't overthink it, as ultimately an uneven layer of rice with some room around the edges makes the job of socarrat monitoring a little easier, since it allows you to see the crispification and eliminate some of the guesswork. Think of the edges as your canaries in the coal mine. If the thinnest part looks underdone, you can bet the thicker part needs even more time. But if it looks like it's starting to burn, you can cut the heat and rest assured that the thicker layers of rice are unscorched. Once you're happy with the way the rice is distributed, nestle in your chicken thighs along with their Chef J style accumulated juices and carefully cover with aluminum foil. At this point, my pan had cooled down enough to the point where it was okay touching the rim, but heat-proof gloves are advised. After that, carefully transfer the pan into the oven, keeping in mind it's full of hot liquid, and bake for 30 minutes. Now I should make clear that 30 minutes is the jumping off point. Every oven is different, so once you're through the initial half hour, remove the foil and see how you're doing. We're aiming to cook until all the liquid has absorbed into the rice and the bottom is starting to crisp up into our third essential S, the socarrat. It should still be wet and viscous at the stage, which means we're getting close. Cook uncovered another 10 or 15 minutes or until the edges start to get dark and almost burnt. At that point, pull out to add your veggies on top and return to the oven for them to warm back up. Since these were boneless thighs, if I could do it all over again, I'd have left them out until this point and added them here with the vegetables, but if you're doing larger bone-in thighs, baking them the whole time is recommended. Give it 2 more minutes and remove from the oven, upon which you should be hearing the sweet symphony of the socarrat. Cover with a clean kitchen towel and cut up some lemons for garnish. Don't skip these, you'll want that squeeze of acidity. After 5 minutes on the counter, grab a wooden spoon and start scraping, mixing the crispy edges up with the more mellow center before serving. And man, was I happy with how this turned out. Some of the edges where the liquid didn't pool in the oven all the way will likely be overcooked, but it's a small price to pay for a paella in which socarrat is found in spades. Plus, at the risk of appealing to authority, even the paella we had at a 2 Michelin star restaurant did the same thing, so don't lose sleep if a corner or two of your sheet pan has rice that's overly crispy and inedible. Big deal. So there you have it, paella in a sheet pan that leaves intact all the integral components of the traditional style while passing over the superficial nonsense. At the end of the day, nothing is ever going to compare with a circular paella over an open flame in the backyard, but this to me is pretty close. I've included a full written recipe in the link in my bio, and if you want to know more about the do's and don'ts of paella as it's served in Valencia, check out this other video I made on the subject that I believe at least one Spaniard has described as great. And if you're up for one more thing, a like and subscribe would be great. So, see you next time. Thanks.